The Revolutionary War provided an opportunity for many Americans to step into roles outside of their typical civilian activities. This transition turned business-minded individuals into patriots willing to risk their resources and safety to support the American cause. This trend is exemplified in the story of the Mersereau family. The first Mersereau on record is John, a French Huguenot fleeing persecution for his Protestant religion. He was born in France around 1627. He was a proud member of his Protestant community despite the discrimination and danger he faced for continuing his association. One evening, he was walking home when he encountered 3 friars. He called out to them, "Good evening, gentlemen." Because he hadn't referred to them as fathers, they realized he was a Protestant and promptly exclaimed, "He is a Huguenot!" drawing their swords and advancing to attack him. In defending himself, he killed one and wounded another, while the third took refuge in flight. Despite making it out from the conflict unscathed, and miraculously free from any legal penalty, Joshua died young, leaving his wife and sons with a difficult choice to make. Stay in France and hide their religious beliefs, or make the long journey out of France where they could live in peace. The family chose to take a leap of faith and begin their journey in search of a new home. First, they fled into England. Finding no safety there, they continued to Switzerland, and realizing that their best bet for freedom was America, they ventured across the Atlantic. However, on their way, dangerous weather conditions shifted them from their intended destination in Philadelphia to New York, where they settled in Staten Island. One of the sons who immigrated to America, also named Joshua, became a shipbuilder in Staten Island and fathered 2 more sons, John and Joshua, who were themselves destined to become pioneers of transportation. The 2 boys, born in 1728 and 1732, worked together to establish the first stage lines from New York to Philadelphia. John Mersereau introduced the first post coach into the United States from England. He was the first to put 4 horses on a mail stage and was obliged to send to England for a driver, only 2 horses before the same vehicle having been driving here before. Their stage line became a huge success, shortening the trip between the 2 cities to a mere 3 days. They eventually incorporated a small fleet of boats into their transportation network, giving them connections in port cities as well as those inland. Their innovation and entrepreneurial tendencies were also shown in their establishment of a string of 5 taverns up the East Coast, primarily in areas through which their stage line ran. Their first tavern was dubbed Blazing Star, and situated in their hometown Staten Island. Some of the operators within their transportation network renamed their own establishments Blazing Star, to demonstrate the close relationship they had with the Mersereau brothers. One of these taverns became the French Arms Tavern, described as the handsomest and most commodious house in Trenton in its day. The tavern was occupied by Royal Governor Lewis Morris, and was involved in one of the most brutal murders of the New Jersey campaign. After the war, the tavern received its new name and served as the location of the New Jersey Ratification Convention for the United States Constitution.
Meet the latest graduate at King's College.
Joshua had been educated at King's College, now Columbia University, and practiced law in New York City, as well as maintaining his role as an active partner in his brother's transportation empire. During the war, Joshua served as Quartermaster General of New York State Troops and Deputy Commissary General of Prisoners on Washington's staff. He organized countless prisoner exchanges and had control of large groups of prisoners throughout New York and Massachusetts, including all of the prisoners incarcerated following General Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga. The following is an excerpt from a letter Joshua wrote to Washington, requesting his opinion on the decision to move German prisoners out of Boston or to keep them there throughout the winter. Mersereau proposed moving the prisoners out of the area to avoid the unnecessary strain that they would place on the area's resources during the winter months. He writes, "Where the Germans and 53 RT are kept, as it will be too cold without fire in the winter, and to bad building chimneys then beg the favour of your Excellencies or Colonel Beatty's direction in this case. As there is no room in the barracks for those men, I have been obliged to make many shifts for want of instructions. It having been so difficult to get them in this out-of-the-way place, many letters have been miscarried, others 6 and 8 weeks before I received them. I have the honor to be your Excellency's most obedient, humble servant, Joshua Mersereau." Mersereau's commanding officer, John Beatty, held his decision under suspicion and wrote to Washington himself to address his own concerns regarding the exchange. Beatty writes, "I am honored with your 2 letters of the 26th and 8th. The former enclosing that of Mr. Mersereau's I have duly noted, and now trouble your Excellency with the answer, which I must request may be forwarded to him by the earliest convenience. Should that gentleman appear to make his defense, I also wish to have a hearing, as perhaps I may adduce some circumstances to support the charge." There is no record of whether or not the transfer eventually occurred, but these excerpts provide an example of the countless similar transfers that Joshua organized. Washington also requested the services of Joshua's son, John LaGrange Mersereau, as a spy. From the documents that remain, it seems that John was the more active spy, going on missions to find information about British movements, while his father was a lower-profile asset that passed along tips that he gathered from the prisoners he monitored. Together, the two became the first members of the Mersereau spy ring. Joshua and his son worked with many other spies in New York, including Hercules Mulligan,
How did we know that this plan would work? We got spy on the inside, that's right.
Still a spy on the British government. I take the measurements, information, and then I smuggle it. Some of this revolutionary covenant. I run with this sense of liberty, and I am loving it. See, that's what happens when you walk in swinging the shit. Somebody's gotta shovel it. Hercules Mulligan. I need no introduction when you knock me down again.
Hugh Mulligan, John and Baker Hendricks, Nathaniel Sackett, retired Army Captain Elijah Hunter, and James Rivington, a loyalist newspaper publisher who used his information to become a valuable Patriot spy. The ring would expand to include many other Mersereaus, but was eventually led by Elias Dayton, a non-relative spy. Together with the infamous Culper spy ring, these brave individuals relayed countless messages to General Washington, Nathaniel Greene, John Hancock, Alexander Hamilton, and others. The Mersereau brothers corresponded with General Washington and other members of the intelligence agency quite frequently throughout the war. Another of the Mersereau spy ring's major successes during the Revolutionary War was concerning Major John Andre. The following is an excerpt from a historical monograph that discusses Washington and his spies. The fifth intelligence success of the Continental Army was the Mersereau ring's capture of British spy Major John Andre in September of 1779. An agent from the Mersereau ring reported that Major Andre was using a false name and was expecting the surrender of the American garrison at West Point, New York. Upon learning of Major Andre's identity, Major Talmadge had Andre immediately arrested. The capture of Major John Andre by American forces thwarted the British plot to purchase the American fort at West Point, New York from American General Benedict Arnold. While working with John Andre, Arnold had agreed to surrender West Point to the British for 20,000 euros, which is approximately $1.1 million. This would have enabled the British to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies, significantly weakening the American position. John LaGrange Mersereau had begun his career in espionage at the age of 19, and was shortly replaced by his younger brother Joshua when he accepted the position as Assistant Deputy Commissary of Prisoners. Joshua was only 14 when he started his work with the Mersereau spy ring. He moved back and forth in a small skiff every day to gather any information he could about the British strength, potential threats, and other information requested by General Washington. His actions allowed his older brother John and his father Joshua to focus their time on gathering specifically requested information, as well as the general information from the prisoners they detained. Together with his father Joshua Sr., Joshua Jr. participated in a mission derived from the first successful intelligence tip of the war, during the winter of 1776. At this point in the war, the Americans were running extremely low on supplies and settling in for what would be one of their most brutal winters. They desperately needed to rest and recuperate in Pennsylvania without the threat of the British crossing the Delaware behind them. Before the first crossing of the Delaware, the Mersereau spy ring had received a tip about the British hiding boats along the shoreline to be used in pursuit of the Americans if they did decide to cross. Washington, of course, took every reasonable precaution to burn or confiscate any boats, and materials that could be used to build boats. However, Joshua Sr. and his 14-year-old son Joshua Jr. had both accompanied Washington and his army for the crossing, and knew that they couldn't rest until they were absolutely certain that there were no available means for the British to cross the river, at least until the Americans had time to rest and prepare a counterattack. So, the father and son begged General Washington to grant them permission to recross the river and ensure that there were no remaining means of transportation for the British. While inspecting the shoreline, the two found several large Durham boats that had been sunk by a loyalist that lived nearby and would have been used to ferry the British troops across the river. Upon discovering these boats, the Mersereaus raised them from the bottom of the river and bailed out the water, floating them over to the Pennsylvania side and effectively cutting the British off from reaching Washington and his army. When the British did reach the shore, they found no boats or materials that they could use to cross and decided to abandon their effort until later that month when the river froze over. It is widely recognized that a British offensive against Washington's army at this point had the potential to wipe out the entire American cause, as numbers were incredibly low and morale was suffering. By granting them the opportunity to replenish their resources and energy, the Mersereau brothers allowed Americans to prepare for their attack on Trenton later that month, a battle that truly changed the course of the war. The Mersereau family's actions throughout the Revolutionary War provided critical intelligence that helped Washington to plan attacks, organize movements, and determine the best times to take the offensive. Their actions during the first crossing of the Delaware were incredibly important to the American cause. Without the Mersereau brothers and their children, once entrepreneurs turned soldiers turned spies, the outcome of the American Revolution may have been quite different.